Okay, so Scuttlebutt 12 time. And yeah, we're going to be starting off with some contentious issues, and there's also an apology in here. Now, the contentious issue is, well, so it's now gun sizes which make capital ship? I'm sorry. When I saw this come up and I was going, why would you write this? What would possess someone to write this in this way on this channel? I was honestly not sure, because I am sure they are Direwolf's X75 is otherwise a perfectly nice and well-rounded individual, but they actually put in here that, dude, as far as I can recall, pocket battleships at 8,000 tons with 28cm ships are normally considered capital ships. No, they're not. They're cruisers. Anything up to 10,000 tons is considered a cruiser in the Washington Naval Treaty. It does have a 6 11-inch guns, yes, in 2 triple turrets, but whilst that makes it an extremely powerful heavy cruiser, if you consider the basic entry point for capital ships in the modern fleets is 14 inches at this point, and they're mostly turning around 15-inch and 16-inch guns, 11 inches doesn't make you a capital ship. Basically, there's been size inflation. Added to that, their speed and the general other factors of the Deutschland class, and no, they're cruisers. Paper Talk calls them a pocket battleship, but they're cruisers. I'm sorry to disappoint you on this, but just because they have a big gun doesn't make them a capital ship. It's one of the reasons why monitors are also not capital ships, despite them having much bigger guns. Some of them had 15-inch guns, but that don't make them a capital ship. It just doesn't. And 8,000 tons, it's really not that heavy at this point. It really isn't. But you were commenting on pom-pom or bofas, and you felt that climmed ammunition wasn't a negative, because it was specifically made so that it could be constantly replenished unless I'm gravely misrecall. Yes, it can be constantly replenished, but it takes time. And if you have any mistakes, or if anything happens to the person doing it and it requires extra people running around, and as you're maneuvering around, it adds more complication into the process, which causes things to be slowed down. And the response about the pocket battleships, the Deutschland class, came because I said the Germans didn't have capital ships at the time. They didn't. And I'm not sure then why you said 5,000 tons is load for heavy cruisers. The pocket battleships were not 5,000 tons, and also, in the nicest way, heavy cruisers weren't 5,000 tons. That's a light cruiser territory. Yeah, no, none of the things you're bringing up. And the Panzercarbon, yeah, they are not anything. Okay, they're small light cruisers, and if they have sort of the other interesting vessels you're talking about, they are realistically coastal defense ships. They do fit many categories, and they fit quite a well-known category, coastal defense ship. We've talked about it on this channel quite a few times. The 40mm are better than POMs. It may not be a huge degree, but any navy in the world that had to choose between twos, and no one ever considered double POMs. Yes, but you also had quadruple, octuple, and many various other amounts. And lots of other people did actually go with the double POMs. Pom-poms. I've never quite called it, and heard the pom-poms called the double POMs before. It's a bit weird, but okay, it's fine. That's what you want to go with. Sweden didn't, and as I've said before, it's because of the criteria they're looking at, and the kind of battle space they're looking at, and about why they're choosing these weapon systems. And it's one of the really interesting things you get into, and I'll reiterate this sort of point, was that if you think your battles are going to be short and sharp, and especially carrier battles, or battles where you're not sure if you're going to have air support, and you want to therefore engage your enemy as far as you possibly can, then the both of us make sense. If you think the battles are going to be long, your aerial battles, they're going to be long and ongoing, and you're just going to need to keep filling the air with lead, and you have got outer-air defense, you have got fighters, you have got heavy air guns, you have got a full battle, then the pom-poms make more sense. And one of the really interesting things that I was involved in about a year and a half ago was a little study for, just a fun study. It was some of my friends and I put together. I was part of it, but there were coders and other people who are far better with that sort of stuff than me. And we put together simulations to test the idea of which would be what World War II weapons would have been the best for dealing with the drone threat. And especially when you're dealing with small drones, pom-poms are better. Why? Because their rate of fire and because of the belt-fed ammunition, they can keep fire for longer. So you can produce a beaten area in the sky. And that can help you dealing with especially smaller drones coming in swarms. And it was an interesting thing to put together because the whole thing is, what is the threat you're expecting? That reflects what weapon system you prefer. And this is why I'm always very careful when I'm talking about weapon systems. It's to judge whether it's capable of managing against the threat it finds itself against. Not necessarily is it better than something else, which is for a different threat. They have to be judged against the threat they find themselves. And yeah, honestly, in some of the carrier battles, some of the convoy carrier battles for the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, the Bofors would not have been as helpful as the pom-pom because of the sheer volume of fire it could put up. But conversely, if I was the Italians, the Regia Marina, who don't have their own aviation and don't have much support from Regia Aeronautica, I'd probably want to go with the Bofors. Because it would allow me that greater range of engagement, and I'm probably against carrier aircraft or the few strikes you get from the British, so it's going to be a small, sharp engagement. So I want to find time for that individual engagement. I'm not going to be dealing with mass waves upon waves of aircraft coming in and have to keep on firing because I'm on an almost constant air attack for hours at a time. And I don't have to worry, therefore, about what fatigue to gunner to loaders, etc. is going to do to performance on my guns. And that's the thing, it's ancillary stuff. No, clipped ammunition, there's advantages and there are disadvantages to it. There are. If it comes to management, movement around ship, it's far easier to move around ship, it's far easier to store. All these things, there is advantages. But there is the fact that if you're in a longer term engagement, you're going to get people getting tired. You're going to have to swap people around the gun, or you're going to have to find extra people elsewhere. And so, that's the thing, it's half a dozen, 1/6 of the other. It's half a dozen, 1/6 of the other. But then we carry on. Now, this one I made a mistake in response to. Because someone put up what they call the minor correction. And by the way, might be true, but there is nothing more annoying in the English language as a phrase than minor correction. Suggested for the compare and contrast, especially when you can't correct it. Because in the nicest way, I don't know if you realise as YouTube videos, I can't go and edit them. I can either cut bits out, so I could go and cut all the stuff out with that screen in, or I can delete the video and upload another one, in which case it'll be deleted, it'll be cannibalized by the YouTube logarithm and never do anything. So you don't really know. So you can't do that. So there is almost, you can point these things out, but it's not a correction I can make. It's an error in it, but it's not a correction I can really make, other than putting a scuttlebutt. You appear to have substituted the figures for propellant charge. Well, this confused me, because first when I looked at the figures you were giving, I went to look at my Excel spreadsheet. And that's why I responded the way I did, because I said, no, I think you've got it wrong here. And let me explain. So, if I show my Excel spreadsheet, and that should pop up there. Yes, there it is. There is my Excel spreadsheet. It's a beautiful thing. I produce these for almost every single time I do something which has tables. I do them all in Excel first. If you look at the table, it is correct. This table is correct. And we again go, and I thought, have you confused the tables? Because if I look at the figures provided here for the bursting charges for here, for the Mark II, there's the figures given. All right, that matches up with what you're saying. But something was niggling me, so I thought, I'll go check. I will go check the other options. And so I did. I went and checked at the table. And somehow, between making the Excel spreadsheet and making this, which I literally just copied and pasted across, this, and then just put it into the Excel format, the colours of blues, has managed to change. So the bursting charge here is incorrect. No idea why. No idea why. Because, again, if we look at the Excel spreadsheet, and go to the right table in there, you'll see there's the bursting charge. There's the correct one. And there was, you did have an interesting idea of where it came from. You explained that, it could have come from the repellent charge or other things for the gun. And the thing is, that's not in my table. So, how it happened, I will never know. I'm not sure what happened there. Because it's correct here, and the closest source of figures for a bursting charge would be potentially these ones, but they're not exactly the same as what is up there in the Excel spreadsheet. Again. So I have no idea what happened. I am completely lost with what happened. So I apologise. And I apologise for saying I thought you were wrong, because I went and checked my Excel spreadsheet first, because, believe it or not, when I want to check my tables, I go check where I did all the tables, because I don't change them, I literally copy and paste. So I have no idea what happened. I really don't. I could blame the senior fluffy research assistant, but it's probably I managed to press a button or something by mistake and didn't realise it, and have managed to. It's probably Picnic. It's probably problem in share, not in computer. But all I did was copy and paste and do the usual thing of let the designer edit. And yeah, make sure the colours are right and the text is visible, and that's about it, because, I'm just copying and paste from where I've sorted out all the things. Who knows what the frigate happened? I really don't. Anyway, so, should say this properly. Apologies, Simon's the good, for my first response, because my first response was literally based on checking my Excel spreadsheet. And I was fine there. And then I went and checked the PowerPoint and went, I'm not fine. And what's even funnier is, and I will explain this one, if I do the Windows capture thing and I go back to the PowerPoint, that's the wrong PowerPoint. That's the right PowerPoint. This, as you can see, is a picture. I can't click in it, which is unusual for me. Whereas this one, I can click in there. So I've done a lot of weird things with this table, and I have no idea why. I have no memory of doing these weird things. I don't know what happened here. It might have been because of the amount of text, sorting it all out, making it work. I did some changes and some things got moved around. I have no idea, but yeah. So apologies. No idea what happened there, but something weird did. Anyway. With that being said, next one was IGN rank inflation. And this is pretty darn fun again, because this was one of the couple of questions from Clarke. No relation, but usually a source of very fun questions. The question is, you talk in this video about the rank congestion you were saying at the Captain and Rear Admiral at the beginning of the war, and how they're basically held there. This raised a question to me about what I can only describe as rank inflation in the IGN, which we also touched on at least briefly in other videos, I think. I remember this course for Related Golf. How much did the over-proliferation of senior flag officers impact the Japanese tendency towards friction-inducing operational complexity? I mean, we've seen them sending out vice admirals that point to the wall with fairly tiny task force groups, a couple of cruisers and a destroyer or two. How much of the IJN's penchant for wildly dispersed operational concepts and complex over-converging thrusts was an attempt to placate internal fractionism and senior officers that represented those factions with substantive combatant commands? Not as much as you might think. Actually, the problem for the Japanese in the senior officers, and the reason they have so many, is because, honestly, they don't do independent command that well. Now, that sounds terrible, but let me explain. The Japanese system was all about making very elite officers who were very good at functioning in the role they were trained to do initially. You were making the best pilots. You were making the best torpedomen. The problem is, it then takes a very long time to train people who are so perfect to become good at being the generalists you need to do strategic command or even tactical command of a mixed force. Think about it this way, it takes time to retrain them. There is a reason why so many of the better leaders in World War II and World War I, in terms of navies, tend to, whilst they've been good at things, they weren't necessarily really the best at one of the combat arms. They are best at strategy, they are best at leadership, they are best at, conceiving war, but they weren't necessarily the best at graduating the best ever torpedoman, or the best ever pilot, or the best ever navigator. Because usually the people who are the best at those things, and if they're selected for being the best at those things, will be brilliant at those things. But because they're brilliant at those things, it takes them longer to adapt to other things. Or do you have the other problem? And I saw this a lot as a kid growing up. And I suppose it always hit me slightly differently because, in a way, my superpower when it comes to studying work is knowing my weaknesses. I know I'm dyslexic. I know my dyslexia is a form of short-term memory. It's a genetic dyslexia. Just part of my brain doesn't work the same way. And I know it causes me to have terrible handwriting. And I know it means that I have to read things more if I want to remember them. But the thing is, once I do remember them, they're permanently in there because they've got into my long-term memory. So it's kind of a superpower in that I know my weakness is reading it once is not going to help me. Reading it once and writing it out once is not going to help me. I have to read it about 5 times and write it out about 6 times to be able to remember it. But I know if I do that, I'll never forget it. Now that's kind of a humbling thing for a kid growing up. It means you always know that you always know you have this weakness, so you have to do this work. But if you do this work, there is a payoff, so it's worthwhile doing it. But I had lots of friends who were, like me, were scholarship kids, were students basically selected for the program because they were smart and they'd make the school look good in its grade times. That's fine. Of my friends growing up who were in that group and going on, they used to have the thing they were really good at, and they'd be really, really good at it. But they had 2 reactions when they found something, were involved in something else, and it didn't come to them naturally, like the thing. They'd either decry it as stupid and not worth doing, or, and this was more often the case, they'd quietly ignore it if they could. And that's not sensible. That's not sensible. You see, again, if I'm being honest, the superpower for me wasn't the knowing my weakness, it was being stubborn enough to know that I'm going to do that to overcome my weakness, because I'm in permanent competition with myself. I get used to that. But the Japanese, by selecting for people who are the very best to do what they do, i.e. be torpedomen, be those things, then you go, right then, okay, you're an excellent torpedoman. I now want you to, or an excellent engineer, I now want you to command a ship. Okay. You have to deal with navigation, all the different issues. Fine. But it's a destroyer, so it's built around torpedoes. Oh, that's fine. I can work out how to do it. Now I want to command a cruiser group. Now I want to command us. And so what you end up with, instead of rear admirals really realistically being rear admirals, they're almost apprentice admirals in the Japanese system. Many of them. They're almost apprentice admirals. And senior captains, again, are almost apprentice admirals. And vice admirals are really what we would consider the equivalent of rear admirals in the Royal Navy or the US Navy in terms of how they're expected to act. And then, you know, you have the admirals above that. And you do have factionism. That does play a part. And satisfying these groups, etc., and who's getting what position. But realistically, that's your problem. That rear admirals are almost not considered admirals like they should be, because even senior captains are not necessarily considered up to the task of doing what they need to do as commodores or anything if they're acting in that role. Some are. There are exceptions to this. There are exceptions, which is what muddies the water, because you can point to exceptions and go, they have this. But then you have to start looking at them as the whole. Not looking at the individual exceptions. The individual exceptions can lead you to all sorts of misinformation and all sorts of bad positions. You have to look at them on the whole, on the mass. And then go, okay. Alright, as a whole, the rear admirals seem to be being treated as not necessarily glorified ship commanders, but they're very, very strictly, these are your division, this is your small group of ships. You are sub the Vice Admiral, you are learning from the Vice Admiral what to do. And the Vice Admiral is leading the operation. And the Vice Admiral, this is also one of the reasons why you end up, and this is something I've talked about in leadership of the Battle Midway and various other operations for the Japanese, where their admirals are seemingly holding multiple positions at the same time. They've got multiple hats. And how that kind of overloads them, because they're supposed to be thinking in terms of this whole group, whilst also they're doing this, and this, and this. And how that complicates matters. Well, that's one of the reasons why you have this scenario. Because honestly, they don't trust their rear admirals. If you did, the very easy thing would be to have rear admirals and commodores in there doing those subunits, allowing the senior officer to concentrate on what they're supposed to be doing, running the whole force. Or, when you're sending out these small penny packet forces, you would send them out with rear admirals and commodores in charge of. But they don't. So that's really the issue Japan fights on. Also, it does fit to an extent with their approach to a lot of things. Everything, the Japanese have very much an apprenticed service, a master-student relation to service and leadership and how people are promoted. And again, you see that still going on into the rank of Rear Admiral. And yeah, that hopefully explains it all. Anyway, that being said, Shameless Book Plug. So, Shameless Book Plug. Well, oh good lord, recording a Shameless Book Plug. I always like this part. I always like saying thank you to everyone for supporting the channel, for liking, sharing, subscribing, for especially the subscribe button if it's got a bell. And, well, there's a few things happened. One, I managed to get the memberships widened up on the channel and actually functioning properly. Because I started up memberships when they first came out, and honestly, functionally it didn't work at lower settings, but now it does. So there's now a 99p membership, a $4.99 membership, and an $8.99 membership. I have no idea what the differences are on YouTube, but they are there, because some people prefer to do YouTube, some people prefer to do Ko-fi, some people prefer to pay Patreon, and some people just watch the videos and sit through the ads, or are Prime members and watch the videos. And all of that helps. That really does. Although I have something fun to say. Look, I did because people were asking me this question the other week, and I had absolutely no frigging idea how much it did, because I knew it wasn't much, but I hadn't really bothered. I looked up what my lifetime earnings from short videos are. You know, the shorts, which I sometimes do on this channel. And honestly, they really aren't worth the time it takes me. Because if you consider the time I put into shorts, into recording them or editing them, sometimes fuel to go to drive places where I go and record one of those things, the entire lifetime of shorts has netted me £31.92. It's possibly bought a book in aggregate. So thank you. Memberships and Patreon and Ko-fi. This is why I say those are the things which matter on the channel, and thank you to everyone who supports me in those ways, because they really do. And super chats and super thanks and all those things. It really is a massive difference. And yeah, you know, it wouldn't work without your support. It wouldn't be possible to do all the books and do all the research and all the things I'm doing without your support, so thank you. That's what I say in all these bits. It's always thank you, and this is why. It's thank you, because without your support, it just isn't happening. It really hasn't. There's also a fair number of people who have done things like, I don't know, done some recent buying on Spreadshirt store. Thank you. Other stores to come soon. I'm going to see what other merch we can get for people, because, again, I'm weird. I view merch as community stuff, which is why I always set the profit margin to the minimum that they'll allow me to do it at. So make enough that it pays them and they get their money, and there's a small bit going to me. Because I'm just amazed there is a community supporting this channel. I just find it amazing. So thank you. Thank you. Also, to the person who commented the other week that they don't like these Shameless book plug sections because it's me talking on the channel, explaining the stuff going on and in my life. If you go down to the description, you will see, and actually, if you click on the thing below the time tag, usually there's a section labeled Shameless book plug, and that's when the Shameless book plug is. You can just skip past it. You don't have to watch it. It's a brilliant thing. You don't have to if you don't want to. Now, this question, which was again put in by Clarke, so thank you again for another long one. It was such a long response, such a long question, I can actually not fit it on the page and show it to everyone. It was that long a response. I tried to figure out if I could divide it in 2 or divide in 3, put it across the full screen, record this video as the first 4K video to go up to get it in there. It didn't work. So what I've done is I've taken the end section. But please note, there are 5 paragraphs, each of them many times longer than this one, on the comment. It is beautifully put together. It is massively worth a read. This is another thing why I love going through the comment section on my channel. It's just, there's so much interesting stuff in there. And yeah. And basically, it's the response to, well, what happens if Midway is a far more even battle? If it's a far more even battle, what happens? And all of Claire's ideas are outlined through it. And her ending question is this. My question for you is, would this just lead to the US doubling down the Essex Swarm and maybe shifting resources around to get the early wave of new carriers into service? Or would it lead to getting the lead on Midway design, getting the more survivable platforms under construction, and shifting resources from the later Essex waves to Midways? Or is there a third secret option, i.e. throw everything into subs and mines and make struggling and starving out Japan by a blockade strategic objective of the Pacific War? Now, this is an interesting point to get in, because basically the idea is, okay, without the carriers around, and the carriers, you know, if you've got more even damage, and the Japanese have done better, what do you do? Do you still go the Essex Swarm, or do you do Midways? And I think you would probably see an increase in the Midway program. I wouldn't be surprised if they are earlier, but I think you still get the Essex swarm. I think what might happen if the Americans lose carriers is the interesting thing is the Alaskas. Okay, and bear with me on this. You might see the Alaskas rushed in as carrier escorts with a lot of heavy AA added on. They might be turned into floating rapid AA barges, anti-air defense ships. It's either that or a program of Atlantas. Those are your two options to get in something. Atlantas are probably easier, but it requires you ordering new ships. Alaska's you already got under construction, and you can put a huge amount of AA on them. And they're also useful for other things. I don't really see the war effort changing in terms of its overall outcome, although about Guadalcanal that does lead to having more destroyers and cruiser assets later on in the war. But it's going to lead to other battles and other situations, especially probably in the Australia region. It might also lead to there being, in terms of war effort, when the fighting actually starts to take place, there being an increased British presence because you're that much further along in the Mediterranean, in the North Atlantic campaigns, in the European theatre of war. The reason I'm saying this is because ultimately you still need control of the sea. And if the Japanese have got some carriers and you have lost, let's say you've both lost a pair of carriers, you're in a situation where you've got a lot of repairs. You've still got Saratoga, but they've got repairing as well. And so you have a far more even contest going on. And if the Japanese also take a Midway, then you're going to have to do something about it. And for the Americans, that's going to mean they are probably going to have to use their carriers to try and take back Midway, the carriers they do have. And the Japanese don't need to hold it for long. That's the point. When I was talking about the Midway, I said Midway is almost an attempt at a decisive battle. Because the thing is, if you can take Midway, the Americans are going to have to take it back. It might not be that much use, but they're going to have to take it back. And that means they're going to have to send the forces to take it back. And so you can sucker in and force the Americans to come on, and force the Americans to come to you. You can goad them into fighting you in such a way that you can potentially attrit their forces. If you've got enough submarines there, and if you've got enough other assets in the area. Potentially the Japanese do have that ability, especially if they have land base there supporting it for long range, with reconnaissance and all those things. To provide them with warning. Basically to do the very thing to the Americans that the Americans use Midway to do to them. And it worked very well for the Americans against the Japanese at Midway. So there is a chance it works well for the Japanese against the Americans in Midway, if they do in reverse. But that's ultimately the issue. Because the Americans will lose ships doing it, but they'll still do it. And the more damage they take, the more losses they take, more things like the Midways are going to seem far more attractive. Because remember, the Midways don't come from nowhere. The Maltas don't come from nowhere. They're basically... The Americans don't want to produce unarmoured carriers. They want to have the solid flight deck. They want to have the same things the British have. But there's the treaties. It's like the British want to have carriers with as big air groups as the Americans. But there's the treaties, where you have the scenario where to get enough carriers on 135,000 tons total limit, to have enough decks, you have to make compromises. You either have to compromise on the individual carrier survivability or the air group. Those are your two options that you can muck around with. But neither nation wanted to. If you asked them both, they would have been, if they'd been up to them, they would have been churning out 27,000-ton ships from the get-go with armour and with a big flight deck. And you had basically implacables / earlier designs of the Midways or proto-Midway Maltas the whole way through. And yes, the Americans would have probably had slightly more aircraft still than their British counterparts, and the British would have had slightly more armour and defense than their American counterparts. But broadly speaking, they wouldn't have been that different. And so, what I see if they do take casualties, if they do find themselves in a situation, is them reverting to what do they want? Well, they know what they want, they just have to get it through. But it was all an interesting discussion you're putting forward. It was. Then we get the subs and signals. Now, at this point, Steve Clarke is asking two questions. And one, submarines. There is not much discussion other than public domain. On deployment of submarines, you do say that this operation is rushed by the Japanese, not getting scouting submarines in place in Central Pacific in support of operations. Is this doctrinal thing, i.e., these are commerce-rating assets for the USN, or just due to the issue of communication between the units and base and dissemination of data to commanders? Basically, the trouble is with having the submarines is, do you have them available, and are they in the right place? Because submarines can move quite far, quite fast on the surface in this period, but if they're on the surface, they lose their advantage of being able to be stealthy and being able to hide. They produce a wake like all ships. They can be spotted from the air with radar and other things. So you have problems with that. And then with the communications, you have the fact that submarines tend to communicate back to base. Then submarine headquarters will communicate with main headquarters. Main headquarters will send that information back to the fleet. And so you have a delay on the information getting through. It can still get through fairly quickly, but there's going to be a delay. But they're still there. The reason not much is discussed is because often the information is great for a strategic scenario. But once you go into a tactical scenario, it's better that the submarine tries to engage the target itself than tries to tell everyone else what's going on. Because by the time they get the information, it's going to change. It's that whole thing about, like with anti-ship ballistic missiles, when we start talking about them. Yeah, they're firing. Great. And they're very, very fast. But the distances they're engaging at, if they're engaging at maximum distance, it's going to be 45 minutes to an hour. So you have to hope that the ship's being consistent bearing for that time, and you know where it's going to be. Because, again, mid-course and especially final course, aiming and targeting can be very difficult to get through. In fact, it can be virtually impossible if they're going at very high speeds with the plasma layer around them, etc. All these things, it's just not going to work. And it's the same with if you are trying to launch carrier strikes against moving assets based on submarine information. You know where that ship was that long ago. You don't know where it is now. This is why it's better if you can sort of get a scouting aircraft to go in and shadow the fleet and try and give it away its position constantly. And then 2, signals intelligence. So much the Allied success of World War II is with intelligence intercept. So are the Japanese as inept as the Germans, or slightly better, or even worse in your opinion, the Japanese inability to fight the intelligence war in the Pacific against the USN? Oh no, the Japanese were normally quite good. This is one of the reasons why I find Midway absolutely absurd. The Japanese are normally pretty darn good, especially compared to their Axis counterparts. They do normally exhibit the required level of paranoia. And this has led to some interesting discussions. There were some interesting discussions of people going, well, these messages were going out in the open from all these bases, and there were lots of different... Yeah, here's the thing. You're supposed to be paranoid. That's essentially what you're paid to be as an intelligence officer. To be paranoid. You're supposed to basically be going, hang on, why is this information out in the open? Why are they broadcasting in the open? Because let's say it's the water plant. Okay, encoding it, decoding it does add time to transition. Let's say it's half an hour out of your way. How long is it going to get the parts out to fix it? Well, if they're small, they can be put on a plane. But that's still going to be a few hours to find a part, organise it, etc. So the time taken to encode and decode that information is not going to add much onto the time of delivery. If it's large, you've got to schedule a ship. Again, the time taken to encode and decode that information is not going to hurt things. You're not going to get a rapid water transit. So why would you send anything about a water system in the open? Especially when, as an island base, that's immediately going to be, oh, well, they're running out of water. That's going to be terrible for garrison morale, garrison health. They're going to have to rapidly resupply that, so there's going to be merchant ships coming. Oh, I can get a submarine there to maybe block that off. You don't do it. And again, if you go the other tasty morsels, they're all such tasty morsels. They would never have been allowed up because, again, the intelligence officers at Midway, if they'd heard someone, a logistics officer, was trying to send that signal, and the intelligence officers tend to have their officers next to the signals office just so they can check on whatever people are trying to send out, they'd have shot them for breaking for breaking information protocol. Literally, the intelligence officer would have walked in and gone, "You're a traitor to the US," and put a bullet through their head. Unless it's the intelligence officer sending it as a ruse. So, yeah. The Japanese are usually fairly good in intelligence. They have all sorts of electronic sniffer units. They have all sorts of interesting things they're doing in the war. And they're capable. But Midway, oh my God, do they drop the ball so many times. It's terrible. It's why I talk about it as much as I do, because it is out of sorts for them. It really is. Now, this was the interesting discussion for me, which happened on the Vistal Focus, was the amount of people who sort of come out going, "Wow, actually, you're right about the Vistal Focus." There was even someone, a couple of people commented, "Oh, you should have talked more about the more famous examples." And the reason I didn't talk about more famous examples of the Vistal Focus of the British forces in this period in development was because if I talked about them, the video would immediately become about them. And I was talking about Britain's obsession with supersonic Harriers. So I needed to talk about the ones which were maybe less famous of the examples because they better illustrate the history. And they mean I don't have to talk about them as much. I can talk about the flow of development and the programs going through. Whereas if I'm talking about the famous one, for example, there was one which a mock-up was actually shown to Margaret Thatcher, I've got to talk about that because that's a very interesting bit of history. And that means I don't talk about what I wanted to talk about in that key aircraft video. Now, again, the interesting focus was people going, well, what's the focus for this? Is it the carriers? Is it the threat of nuclear war? And it's all these things. It's all these things. And these programs were all about trying to maximize infrastructure survivability. And the infrastructure we're talking about is airfield capacity. Not as in the individual airfields, not as in the collective airfields, but airfield capacity as in spaces you can use as airfields. Because you have to remember, in World War II, they'd been able to do a lot of rough field work. They'd been able to take off grass fields. It had worked. It had been useful. It had been incredibly important. And now you can't. And suddenly your world shrinks. It's the beginning of the problem of what I now call the Google problem. If you can Google a target, you can hit it. Because you have its address, its coordinates, and it's a 3D map if you have Google Earth. Well, this is the period when they're starting to get to that point, because there's satellite reconnaissance systems, there's all sorts of stuff being put up, and there's espionage added on top of that. It's a problem. So you've got to think these things through. So this stuff gets very interesting. I did say there are a number of you who commented that, they doubted the Royal Navy would ever have got the version they wanted because they wanted a two-seater, this, that, and the other. And I was reminded by the fact that when the Royal Navy was looking into the Harrier and Sea Harrier, they were trying for two-seater, various, this, that, they ended up settling for a single-seater. I honestly think the Royal Navy, to an extent, protested a little too much on this scenario. And they got caught by it. Let me explain. You see, protesting you want these capabilities is all well and good. But when you get them, only 2 of your carriers can use Phantoms. Yeah, you've got Phantoms. And the trouble is now, basically, whenever you're talking about getting aircraft for them, you're talking about buying foreign aircraft. Or maybe getting something to replace the Buccaneer, but that's going to be incredibly expensive and single source. And it's also not a USP that you're able to sell abroad. Not many foreign purchasers are buying the Buccaneer. As good as it is, not many are. So, you had a problem. Whereas if the Royal Navy had gone down the supersonic Harrier route, had gone down that project's route, initial projects, and carried on trying to push and develop it, A, it would have been something unique to Britain. B, it would have enabled the use of far more carriers than just Ark Royal and Eagle, which would have meant a larger carrier force to cut down. And C, this is quite an important one, it would have been a USP of British industry which would probably have been sold abroad, probably purchased by people like the US Marines. Great foreign orders, that's always a good thing for Britain. And D, sir, do you really want to cut this shining example of British technology if you cut the carriers? It probably does mean that you end up with CVO-1 being, possibly even being a Vistal carrier, being a ski ramp carrier, with being a big one, but being a ski ramp carrier. 35,000 tons probably, maybe 40,000, but built around operating a large air group of these sorts of aircraft. It might still have some catabar capabilities. They might retain some. What they might do is they might have a ski ramp forward and a waste catapult. And a waste catapult will be for launching things like the Gannet or whatever takes over from the Gannet as the airborne early warning aircraft. That would have been the interesting thing. That would have been an interesting scenario. I do think in that scenario, especially if the US Marine Corps are buying whatever the British Harriers are, then the British will end up buying the Hawkeye as a bit of a quid pro quo. But if that is the case, and they're buying them for the new carrier, that means they probably get them for the new carrier. The interesting question is going to be whether we end up with the the Sentries, the E3s, or whether we end up going for an entirely Hawkeye fleet for our airborne early warning for the UK. Personally, I don't think that's necessarily a good fit considering what the RAF wants to do with them. However, considering, if I use a recent example, Britain has now decided to get 12 F-35As for the operational conversion unit, which to do some training for pilots, and for the nuclear role. Out of a fleet they're planning of buying 138 F-35s. The fact that you're getting this smaller fleet within a fleet, and despite them being slightly cheaper as individual aircraft, to convert to support them because they require completely different probes and refueling systems than Britain provides and all sorts of things, it's probably going to work out more expensive than actually the F-35Bs as an option. Probably in the end. It'll look cheaper up front because of the cost of the aircraft, but once you add in all bits to make it work within the British system, it's going to be very expensive for a small group of aircraft. That kind of shows how stupid the British government can occasionally be. I have nothing against the F-35A, and honestly, I've said if you wanted to buy the F-35A, if you're Britain, that's fine. But what you need to do then is go, right then, how many do we need for the carriers? They each have a maximum air group of roughly 36 F-35s, so we need at least 72 F-35Bs to be able to be generated for both to supply both carriers in the event of a major war. Which means we probably need about 96 F-35B airframes on hand at any one point. Fine. So for the RAF to have a strike squad, a strike wing, etc. If they want to build around A's, that's perfectly fine. How many strike wings do they want? Let's say 1. Okay, then they need at least 48 airframes at any one time. And if we're running through the same metric which is used for the 138 airframes to provide the necessary aircraft available for the Britain and for the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, if you think about it, 96 plus 48, well, that kind of equals 144 aircraft overall. So probably would have actually needed to buy about 160 to 180 aircraft, considering there's going to be some wastage. There are going to be some aircraft which get lost in accidents. It happens. There are squidgy organic bits flying them, and they're trained to do very dangerous things, which means they do very dangerous maneuvers, and sometimes those things go wrong. Sometimes it's the computer that goes wrong, sometimes it's the human. Sometimes it's both. But yeah. It was an interesting time. It was an interesting video to do, and we live in an interesting time now. A lot of very interesting short-term image-focused decisions are going to be made, which are going to be regretted later, and are either going to be turned over later and changed around, or are going to be turned into proper decisions and properly funded. I myself hope it's the latter. Because whilst I do not like the concept of tactical nukes, I don't think they are sensible at all in any way, shape or form. I think you should keep to the strategic deterrent and keep that going completely, and that's basically that's where you want them. You don't having the idea that there is an option where you can use a tactical nuke, and yes, that will work to de-escalate a situation. It doesn't. It really doesn't when you're looking at most nations' nuclear doctrine. When nukes come out, it's not very long till all the nukes fly, and that's problems. That's a lot of problems. I like having nukes because it's a way to deter others from using their nukes. I don't like having nukes that people actually might think about using. That's why I don't like tactical nukes. Just don't. But yeah. Also, there is the old thing, of course, that there are some who are going, well, now they're looking at this for a strike aircraft, and the F-35C is actually the better strike aircraft in terms of range. And this surely means that we should go back and convert the carriers to Scuttlebutt and have a whole sea fleet. And that might have been a sensible thing, but that sensible decision should have been taken a long time ago. Kind of like the Royal Navy should have got 12 Type 45s, what they originally wanted, but at least 9. So we actually had them available when we needed them, and 3 carriers, and also land-based strike force. In which case, you'd be looking at probably about 5 wings each of, well, let's say if you want 36 active F-35s for each of the squadrons, you probably need 48 aircraft per wing, because the 36 active aircraft are going to usually have about 4 aircraft, about 8 to 9 aircraft actually available, and 3 in quick short-term maintenance. And for every 3 aircraft you have in an operational squadron, you need 1 in a engineering squadron, having a full overhaul and maintenance and deep maintenance and being taken apart and reassembled. And that's how you maintain your fleet. So, yeah, you would probably actually be talking about buying somewhere in the region of 240 F-35Cs if you were probably in that scenario. And, again, you could split them evenly between the Navy and the Air Force if you really wanted to. But you probably would give 2 wings to the Air Force and 3 wings to the Navy, because it's 3 carriers and 2 land air wings. Yeah. That wasn't to be. That was far too sensible a thinking. And now we're in the path we are, and we need to make the best of the path we're on. And it's very expensive to change it. It's very, very expensive to change it. Which is an interesting way to get to this question, which was about naval staff leading to better ammunition. Now, this was an interesting discussion because this happened between Richard Cutts and Couch Potato. And Couch Potato is one of the most active researching people I've seen their comments from. And I definitely don't. I think they need to give themselves a better name. or a more accurate one. But they were thinking it through and going, would, having all these staffs mean that you get faulty shells and poor ammunition handling dealt with sooner? The Fourth Sea Lord did exist. As I said, the Fourth Sea Lord was in charge of Royal Navy logistics. It's just I was giving them also control of, how do I put this politely, control of convoy organisation a lot earlier on in that change. The really interesting thing was, though, you're putting together the fact, with a proper staff and all these things going on, would you have fixed the issues with shells earlier on? Here's the thing. On the system I proposed, the Third Sea Lord basically gets the Assistant Civil Lord, the junior minister, as their basically responsible direct minister, to go and help them talk in Parliament, and go and do extra work with them and assist them in that way. And I think that would have made a difference, because, you see, if Jellicoe had had someone to spend time in Parliament actively campaigning on his behalf while he was dealing with the Navy side and be able to swap over and tag team like that, then I don't think they would have been able to run around him and persuade the politicians they didn't need to do the investigation. And if Jellicoe does get the investigation happening before World War One into just remember, he's not just looking into into the shells, but also armor quality. And he gets that done. Then you have probably far better armor quality by the time the Queen Elizabeths are built, but also far better shells by the time World War One comes around. And the shell issues are probably worked out, or at least well on their way to being worked out. And that makes a huge difference. I agree that the battle cruisers evolving from, dreadnought armored cruisers, i.e. battle cruiser 2 words, to battle cruiser 1 words, probably doesn't happen any quicker than it does, and that's because of getting rid of Fisher. You need to get Fisher out for that to be a possibility. But as said, my suspicion is strongly that those Invincibles and Indefatigables are handed off as quickly as possible to the Dominion fleets, so that the Royal Navy itself, the British Royal Navy, can concentrate on battlecruiser 1 words, Lions and better. Because that makes sense for them. And honestly, I think they're looking at better things, especially also if you add on extra battle cruisers being built alongside Queen Elizabeth class and alongside the R's, in terms of you've got a couple of Tigers, you've got a couple of 15-inch battle cruisers coming alongside them. Those are all going to be a lot stronger ships, because they're going to take, it's going to be, you're going to have the 2 Tigers, and then you're going to have whatever the 2 15-inch gun ships are, going to be improved Tigers. So they are going to be a lot better battle cruisers, 1 word. And it would be interesting to see what came about and how strong they'd be. It would be interesting to see how strong they would be. I also think there is a strong possibility, as said, that if you're doing that, then you're getting a 5-ship order for the R class, and they are more likely to be 24-knot ships again, improved Queen Elizabeths. And if you're not building 8, you're building 5, and you're building your 6th ship is your battle cruiser for both those groups. And that means you have a battle line of 10 24-knot ships. Which also, if you think about it, is going to have an impact on things like Nelson and Rodney post-World War One, because the Royal Navy is not going to want its battle line to slow down. It's also probably going to have an impact on the Americans, because if the British are focusing in on their 15-inch gun ships, they're all 3 knots faster than their American counterparts, which means they can dictate range if they are 24-knot ships. That's a problem. That is a big problem. Add in the battle cruisers, and yeah, things are issues. There are lots of issues going on. It's an interesting thing to think about, that these things could have got fixed. It's also the reason I like doing these alternate histories sometimes is to really point out the fact that It's very easy for history to be different. And I do not like the idea some of my colleagues seem to sometimes produce, is that history is almost this preordained path which was always going to flow a certain way. No, decisions have weight and bearing. Even seemingly small, innocuous decisions have weight and bearing. And that's the best lesson of history. With that being said, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Not sure if I normally end Scuttlebutts with a question. I don't think I do, but yeah, on the memberships thing that's included in them, the thing I've put up now is that I'm going to, now, whenever there's a 5th Tuesday in a month, I'm going to make sure that that's a vote, or theoretically should be a vote, on what the topic's going to be for members. So members will get, so YouTube members will get to vote on that. I'm not sure what else to sort of do and how to work this one out, because patrons always been the ones who suggest the topics and have the big vote, and that's the big thing for Patreon. I don't want to do members only videos because that seems a bit rude. And I also don't have enough members that if I do members preview first, it wouldn't kill me in the algorithm. Because basically the first 1 minute, first 5 minutes, first 10 minutes, and first hour of people watching are what decides how well the algorithm is really going to promote you, it seems. So I'm not a big enough channel to do members first streaming. So I've got to figure out what things to do for members. So yeah, maybe that could be the suggestions today. What things should I do for members that I'm not doing that you think I should do more of, or think of, work out how to include? I'd be really interested to know. And what else we got coming up? Well, Pierre-Andre de Suffren is next week's Tuesday video. Ooh, Suffren. Hope you enjoyed Duncan last night when this comes out. Duncan was a cool one. Duncan is a cool guy. A really cool guy. It's a great month having Duncan and Suffren in the same month. It really is cool.